Well, Andrew, we've talked about many a thing in these videos, but one thing that I always get requests about is specifically our opinions on the civil rights movement. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about a couple of people. We're going to talk about Malcom X, and we're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Now, really the center of the discussion is going to be where they deviated and where they came together, and how that's relevant to the modern world. So that's what we're going to do today. How does that sound?
The people have been clamoring for this episode for so long.
It's true.
They've said, Andrew, Nick, I love listening you talk about whales and explosions and I don't remember what else we talked about. But they say you always bring this very scholarish and intelligent approach to your discussions. Please chime in on this thing that occurred 30 years before your birth.
Probably actually more than that, but that doesn't matter here. I feel like there are a certain amount of narratives that have formed around these two men that are perhaps not completely accurate. I feel like there are differences in approach towards gaining civil rights is sort of both exaggerated but also underplayed simultaneously at the same time. I feel like their differences are sometimes usually just kind of cartoonified into this sort of Magneto versus Professor X, type thing. And that's what most people probably think, assuming they haven't done any additional research, assuming that their knowledge of civil rights is just from their high school textbooks, which means both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. probably got like maybe a paragraph, right? Of
Malcolm X, barely even that.
Yeah.
On King.
Yeah, and Martin Luther King obviously he always gets the most play, but probably because
he's more palatable. Yeah.
And that was part of his appeal in the '60s as well. But there's a reason for that. But also, I feel like in the process, his sort of message is also diluted because. Really, especially during the end of their respective lives, they sort of agreed more than they didn't. Let me explain. Malcolm X, in case anyone doesn't know, was the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam during the '60s. He was a proponent of black nationalism. He was a proponent... Sorry?
Kind of important here.
Oh, yes, of course. We're blasting six.
We're so engrossed. Blastin the Lucky Strike, menthol in hundreds.
Absolutely. And I think the difference in their approach, where Martin Luther King was definitely more about nonviolence, he was more about coming together, he was more about the black man and the white man coming together, facing against the common cause of racism. Malcolm X was more militant. He believed that black people needed reason with the white man, and they should arm themselves. The black community should arm themselves in order to protect themselves against these sort of hostile capabilities that the white establishment has put forth against black communities.
As exemplified by his Ballad on the Bullet speech, which was essentially do your due diligence and vote. But also recognize that's not going to fix the problem and arm yourself.
Yeah. And now, I'm not here to say which approach was the correct one. It's not really that black and white, because like I said, there's a lot of similarities here that we can draw from. I just want to clear...
Excellent turn of phrase.
Yeah, exactly.
Given the conversation.
The thing is, these two men, the reason their approaches are so different, I think, can kind of be traced back to their respective childhoods. Malcolm X was born lower class. Martin Luther King was more middle class. Both of them had preachers for fathers. Malcolm X's was probably, according to his family, murdered by white nationalists. Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was not. Malcolm X's father was sort of a proponent of the teachings of Marcus Garvey, which means he was pretty much all about black people sort of forming their own state, not necessarily getting involved with America at all. Like I said, Martin Luther King wanted to fight against segregation and integrate. Now, I think the reason, I think that their childhoods speaks a lot to the reasons they approach these issues the way they did, and I think that can probably be the reason that a lot of people approach certain issues the way they do, is because they either grew up in a poor community, they grew up in a middle-class community. Obviously, if you grew up in a poor community, you have to sort of be more you have to be more aggressive in surviving day to day.
There's no shielding yourself from everything going on around you.
Exactly. So it makes sense that both of them would come to these conclusions that this is the way that it should be. Now, it should be noted that Martin Luther King, despite having, like you said, a more palatable sort of message of love and acceptance, he was no like limp-wristed centrist bullshitter that many people in the establishment today would have you believe. He wasn't the kind of person that would have appreciated his words, his speeches being used in Chevrolet commercials.
Just whenever
and
the masses get too feisty, they feel they need to tote his quotes out.
Exactly.
You guys just relax.
Let's
not push this too far.
And none of these people, let it be clear, none of these people know a single thing
totally
about these men. Except for, like I said, the very broad narratives that have been construed by culture over the years. I don't think when Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin were touting their movement as being reflective of Dr. Martin Luther King's, something tells me he probably wouldn't have agreed.
Vaguely insincere.
Vaguely insincere, I would say, yeah. But here's the thing. Malcom X, once he left the Nation of Islam, mainly because he became a little discouraged from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's sort of personal life, where he sort of kind of put up a front of holiness, but was very hypocritical because he was getting a lot of women pregnant out of wedlock, etc., and abandoning them. This, along with other reasons, led him to leave the Nation of Islam, and eventually, he took a pilgrimage to the Mecca and sort of converted to Sunni Islam. And after this pilgrimage, he wrote a letter to his wife, and in this letter, it showed that his previous feelings about white people, not belonging in the Black Liberation Movement sort of quelled, because when he was in Egypt, he saw that white people, black people, brown people of all races and creeds were sort of coming together and forming a genuine feeling of brotherhood. Now, this didn't quell his anger at the disenfranchisement that black people went through, but it sort of lightened his views on whether white people could lend a helping hand, because
really quick, I feel the need to interject and explain the difference between what the Nation of Islam preached and the more mainstream sort of Sunni Islam, which is one of the two major branches of Islam. You got Sunni and Shia, and that's more mainline. Traces back to Muhammad and the like. But the Nation of Islam is a very relatively recent invention, which preaches this idea that white people were invented by an evil scientist.
Yes.
Right? They were bred into creation by some mad scientists in the Middle East who felt that black people could not lead themselves. So what he did was much like breeding a dog, getting traits you want in a certain dog. He just bred successive generations of lighter-skinned black people to create the white man. And so, you can understand those earlier feelings of hostility toward white people, how that would sort of reflect, in this idea that, white people are these, like lab experiments gone wrong.
Yeah, and one cannot blame Malcom X for these views because of his lived experience.
It's a vile and vicious treatment.
Exactly. And what happened was he went to jail for racketeering and pimping and all sorts of other stuff. He converted to Islam in jail, and he, like I said, served as spokesperson for many years. After he became disillusioned, like I said, he converted to Sunni Islam and wanted to have a more sort of he wanted to change his approach towards civil rights. He wanted to be more inclusive of the black leaders that he previously, during his juncture with the Nation of Islam, were extremely critical of, to the point where he actually called people like Martin Luther King Jr. an Uncle Tom. Now, once he kind of lightened up a little bit, he and Martin Luther King Jr. actually met just once. It was about 30 seconds. This was in Congress.
A photo op, right?
It was kind of like a photo op, but it was more they happened to be at the same place at the same time. This was during the congressional proceedings to sort of make segregation illegal, which of course was a long, drawn-out battle that all the Southern senators and Congress people were filibustered against, and I think one of the longest in America's history. And they met. Malcolm X shook Martin Luther King Jr.'s hand and told him, I'm all in on the civil rights thing, all right? Let's work together. Let's make it happen. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening because the previously mentioned Nation of Islam ended up assassinating Malcolm X. Now, this is very unfortunate for many reasons, because I often think about what could have possibly happened if, these two sort of did actually work together a little bit more in the sort of future, civil rights proceedings. But what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. after that is that he sort of kind of became a little bit more radical. He started involving himself in anti-war protests and in just general anti-capitalism and pro-union protests as well. Because he understood, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand about MLK Jr. or just purposely refuse to bring up, he understood the sort of nature of capitalism, racism, imperialism, all of these things sort of working as one. And he understood that in order to attack one effectively, you need to attack them all. So when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was actually in Memphis marching for sanitation workers' rights. And
yeah, they were trying to quash the union, the sanitation workers' union at the time.
Right.
Yeah, and so the entirety of the civil rights movement, from '55 at the bus boycott up until '65, the legislation passed, MLK considered this like phase one, right?
Absolutely.
Multiple times referred to this as phase one, which is just about getting the constitutional rights that had already been promised. Right? That was the first step. You need to validate those. And then phase two was what you were talking about, which is securing, in his own words, something of an economic Bill of Rights.
Right.
know?
And I think because Martin Luther King called himself a democratic socialist, so this is probably something he always believed, but later in life realized that perhaps doing so maybe a little bit more aggressively was on the table.
We had to lay the groundwork.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He had to lay the groundwork.
Yeah.
His sort of approach was to lay the groundwork to sort of highlight the peaceful nature of his protests, mostly doing marches, sit-ins, stuff like that. The famous March on Washington, which Malcolm X actually attended and called the farce on Washington because he was not a fan of it. And yeah, where was I going with this?
Okay, well, let me vamp a little bit what you think. So yeah, when Nick was talking about the visit to the sanitation workers in Memphis was actually part of a longer campaign by MLK called the Poor People's Campaign, which was with going to a mass popular support. His plan was to travel across the country, a mass popular support, and then go to Washington. Man, I almost called them hordes. With these groups of poorer people that he would have,
I'm sure some people would have called them hordes, including the people that had MLK assassinated. Right. And I'm not talking about James Earl Ray specifically, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But the point being is that these two men, these two great iconic men, were sort of closer together by the end of their respective lives than we are led to believe. We're usually led to believe that they're almost on opposite
parallel
ends.
paths.
Yeah. But it would have been very interesting to see where they would have converged had they kept doing what they were doing. I don't know. It's all sorts of things would have been possible. I don't know if maybe they would have become a little more nullified, like maybe John Lewis did in his later years, or Angela Davis and the like. But I guess we'll never know. And I guess really I just wanted to really just put out there that the different approaches that these two men had were both relevant in their own way. In fact, Malcolm X talked to Martin Luther King's wife, telling him that telling her that his approach sort of helped MLK in its own way, because his more extreme militant rhetoric kind of, was like a reflection of Martin Luther King's.
It's shown like a more positive light.
Exactly. Because then, like the sort of white masses, when they're looking at the two men, they're like, okay, all right, so there's different approaches to be drawn from here. MLK Jr., he seems to speak more to my values, and he is less scary to me, so I'm going to go with him. And then, I guess MLK Jr.'s sort of, his sort of strategy was to kind of draw these people in, and then build from there. Now, I just think that there's a lot to learn from this. I think there's a lot to learn from both these men. And I think that even though they pretty much had a similar goal by the end of their lives, the sort of electricity that fueled their ideologies were both born from very deep emotional responses. In Malcolm X's case, it was one more of anger. And in Martin Luther King's case, it was one more of, I guess, love. And I think both are relevant today. Both can be utilized, and both can be utilized and used as effective techniques in order to get things done today. And I think that in order to make this happen, one must stay educated on what the great men of the past stood for, and one must stay educated on how to move forward. And I'm hoping that this video maybe informed people of a couple things that they didn't know. If not, I'm hoping that this was a nice little time where you saw some. Yeah.
If you want more in-depth information on MLK's sort of economic ideas and his sort of history, buried history as sort of a labor organizer and patron, there's a really good historian named Michael Honey who talks extensively on the subject. He actually, I think last year or the year before that, compiled like a sort of forgotten collection of King's speeches pertaining specifically to labor rights and the like. So, he has like multiple sort of speeches online that you can check out.
Yeah.
Michael Honey.
And even if you think these two men, I think going over their writings and stuff. In Malcolm X's case, there weren't many writings. You can go over speeches and stuff. They're both still very relevant, and they're both still very much worth looking into. I think there's like a movie that's coming out now about Malcolm X and like Sam Cooke and Muhammad Ali hanging out or something. I think that's on Amazon now. Check that out. I hear it's pretty good. And there's a new documentary coming out called MLK /FBI, I believe is what it's called, which details the FBI's contentious relationship with MLK Jr. and probably the civil rights movement at large, which is a whole different subject that we can go into another day, because there's a lot to glean from that. Anyway, you have anything else to say about these guys?
Nope, that'll be it.
All right. Well, stay blasted, folks, and we'll see you next time.